In the final decades of the 19th century, the United States entered a period of extraordinary transformation. Industrial production expanded at a scale previously unimaginable. Railroads stitched together distant regions of the continent, collapsing time and space in ways that reshaped commerce, labor, and daily life. Cities swelled rapidly, absorbing migrants from rural America and immigrants from abroad, while new fortunes accumulated with unprecedented speed. This era would later be described as the Gilded Age, a term that captured both the brilliance of its surface achievements and the fragility beneath them. Among the men who rose to prominence during this period was George Mortimer Pullman. Unlike the political figures whose names appeared in headlines or the financiers who operated quietly through banks and trusts, Pullman's influence was visible in motion. His sleeping cars moved across the country on nearly every major railroad line, carrying businessmen, government officials, and industrial managers through the night in comfort that had previously been reserved for private rail cars. Pullman did not merely participate in the industrial economy, he helped define its standards. The success of the Pullman Palace Car Company rested on a simple insight. Long-distance travel did not have to be endured, it could be refined. Pullman's cars offered privacy, upholstered seats, attentive service, and an atmosphere carefully separated from the noise and discomfort of ordinary rail travel. They were marketed not only as transportation but as an experience. As railroads expanded, Pullman expanded with them, embedding his company into the infrastructure of national mobility. By the 1880s, Pullman's wealth was secure. His reputation as an innovator was firmly established, yet his ambitions extended beyond manufacturing. Like many industrial leaders of his generation, Pullman believed that the problems of modern society were not the result of inequality or exploitation, but of disorder. He saw chaos where others saw freedom, he saw inefficiency where others saw autonomy, and he believed that with sufficient planning, those problems could be solved. Pullman's solution was not legislation or reform, it was design. South of Chicago, on a broad stretch of land adjacent to the Illinois Central Railroad, Pullman set out to build a city from scratch. This would not be a town that evolved organically through competing interests and improvisation. It would be planned comprehensively, governed privately, and operated according to principles Pullman believed reflected rational order. Every street, every building, every rule would serve a purpose. The town would bear his name. At first glance, Pullman appeared to be an answer to the anxieties of industrial urbanization. Contemporary cities were overcrowded and polluted. Housing for workers was often unsanitary, hastily constructed and poorly maintained. Crime and disease flourished in these conditions, reinforcing the belief among elites that unregulated urban growth produced moral decay. Pullman's town offered an alternative vision. Brick homes replaced wooden tenements. Streets were wide, landscaped, and orderly. Public buildings reflected architectural coherence rather than improvisation. Visitors were impressed. Journalists described the town as progressive and humane. Reformers praised its cleanliness and apparent concern for worker welfare. Foreign observers pointed to Pullman as evidence that American capitalism could be disciplined and enlightened. The town became an attraction, a physical argument made of brick and mortar. Yet beneath the surface, Pullman differed fundamentally from every other American city. No one who lived there owned property. Every house, every store, every public building belonged to the Pullman Company. Residents were tenants, not citizens. Their leases were tied directly to their employment. Losing a job meant losing a home. There was no independent municipal government, no elected officials, no public forum for grievances. Authority flowed upward through the company's management structure, ultimately resting with Pullman himself. This arrangement was not concealed. Pullman believed it was essential. He viewed political self-governance as inefficient and prone to corruption. Private management, he argued, could act more decisively and more responsibly. The town was not intended to be democratic, it was intended to be stable. Stability, in Pullman's view, required control. Alcohol was prohibited, saloons were excluded. Commercial activity was carefully regulated. The town offered amenities, but only those deemed appropriate. Churches were permitted, but moral instruction was expected to align with the values of order and restraint. Recreation existed, but it was curated. The environment was designed to shape behavior. For many residents, especially those arriving from overcrowded districts of Chicago, the town initially felt like an improvement. Housing was clean, infrastructure was modern, streets were maintained, children played in safer spaces than those they had known before. The contrast was real, but the benefits came with conditions. Company inspectors were authorized to enter homes to ensure compliance with cleanliness and maintenance standards. These inspections were framed as public health measures, but they carried an implicit reminder of who held authority. Privacy existed only within limits defined by the company. Daily life unfolded under the awareness that employment, housing, and social standing were inseparable. Over time, this awareness shaped behavior. Residents learned what attracted attention and what did not. Conversations became careful. Complaints were voiced privately, if at all. The absence of overt conflict was interpreted by management as contentment. In reality, it reflected constraint. Pullman believed he had solved a fundamental problem of industrial society. By eliminating the disorder of independent urban life, he believed he had created an environment where labor and capital could coexist without friction. What he underestimated was how deeply people valued autonomy, even when conditions were materially improved. As the town matured, its logic remained unchanged. Rent levels were set by the company and justified by the quality of housing and services provided. Wages were determined separately based on market conditions. Pullman maintained that these systems were independent. From his perspective, the town was a business venture, not a charitable institution. This distinction mattered little to residents whose lives were governed by both. The system functioned smoothly as long as economic conditions were favorable. Pullman cars sold well. Orders remained steady. Employment was secure. Under these circumstances, the town's rigidity appeared manageable, but systems designed without flexibility are vulnerable to stress. By the early 1890s, the American economy was showing signs of strain. Railroad expansion had exceeded demand. Speculation had inflated asset values. Financial institutions were deeply interconnected, amplifying risk. When the Panic of 1893 struck, it exposed these weaknesses abruptly. Railroads failed, banks closed, unemployment surged, demand for luxury rail cars collapsed. Pullman responded as an industrial manager, not as a civic leader. He reduced wages, in some cases, sharply. From his perspective, this was a necessary adjustment to market conditions. Rents, however, remained unchanged. Workers now faced shrinking paychecks while continuing to pay the same rent for company housing. Requests for relief multiplied. Delegations sought meetings with management. Appeals were made for temporary reductions. Pullman refused. He believed that yielding would undermine the authority of the system. Concessions, in his view, invited further demands. Discipline, he believed, required consistency. What Pullman saw as principle, workers experienced as indifference. The town that had been presented as a model of mutual benefit revealed its underlying reality. The company controlled employment, housing, and governance. Workers bore the risk. Management retained authority. The contradiction could no longer be ignored. As wages fell and expenses remained fixed, life inside the town of Pullman changed in ways that were not immediately visible from the outside. The streets were still clean, the buildings still well maintained, the appearance of order remained intact. What shifted was the internal calculation every household was forced to make. Families adjusted quietly, meals became simpler, purchases were delayed or abandoned altogether, clothing was repaired rather than replaced. Small debts accumulated, often unnoticed at first, then increasingly difficult to manage. Rent was due on schedule regardless of income. Utility charges continued unchanged. There were no informal arrangements, no room for negotiation, and no alternative housing within the town's boundaries. The design of Pullman left little opportunity for flexibility. Independent businesses were limited by company oversight. Home-based work was discouraged. The town did not encourage side trades or informal economies. Everything operated within the company's framework, and anything outside that framework was treated as disorder. This rigidity magnified economic pressure. In surrounding neighborhoods, workers facing hardship could move to cheaper housing, take in boarders, or seek supplementary work while remaining part of the same community. In Pullman, leaving employment meant leaving the town entirely. The cost of transition was high, and during a nationwide depression, alternatives were scarce. The result was a growing sense of entrapment. Workers understood that the system had been designed to remove uncertainty. What they were experiencing now was a different form of it, not the uncertainty of chaotic urban life, but the uncertainty of total dependency. Their livelihoods rested on decisions made by a company that had no obligation to represent their interests beyond productivity. This awareness spread gradually. It did not arrive as a sudden realization, but as a series of small confirmations, a denied request, a delayed repair, a rent notice that arrived unchanged despite reduced wages. Each instance reinforced the same conclusion. The town existed to serve the company, not the people who lived in it. George Pullman did not see these developments as evidence of failure. He viewed them as a test of discipline. In his understanding of social order, hardship revealed character. A system that could not withstand pressure was not worth preserving. He believed that maintaining authority during difficult periods was essential to long-term stability. This belief was consistent with the broader philosophy of the Gilded Age. Industrial leaders often framed economic hardship as a corrective force. Weak businesses failed, inefficient systems collapsed. Survival was proof of merit. Intervention in this view distorted natural outcomes. Pullman applied this logic to human systems. He did not believe that reducing rents or altering the town's structure would produce loyalty. He believed it would encourage dependence. From his perspective, the company had fulfilled its obligations by providing clean housing and stable employment when possible. Market conditions, not management decisions, were responsible for reduced wages. This distinction, while internally consistent, ignored the lived reality of the town. Workers did not experience wages and rent as separate systems. They experienced them as a single equation governing survival. As conditions worsened, communication between residents and management deteriorated. Requests were formal, impersonal, and consistently denied. Meetings were avoided. Pullman himself refused to engage directly with worker representatives. He believed that personal involvement would undermine managerial authority and encourage further demands. Distance, he believed, preserved order. For workers, it signaled disregard. The absence of dialogue eliminated any sense of partnership. The town was no longer perceived as an experiment in shared progress. It was seen as an apparatus designed to extract labor while minimizing obligation. Yet even as resentment grew, overt protest remained rare. The town's structure discouraged public assembly. There were few spaces for collective discussion. Political activity was discouraged. Organizing carried obvious risks. The system was effective at suppressing visible unrest, but suppression did not eliminate dissatisfaction. It concentrated it. Men spoke quietly with co-workers. Families compared expenses. Stories circulated of inspections conducted without notice, of repairs delayed despite rent paid in full, of warnings issued for minor violations. None of these incidents alone produced revolt. Together they created a shared understanding. The town functioned without dissent only because dissent had nowhere to go. This silence was misread by management as compliance. In reality, it represented accumulation. By the time workers began to organize formally, the decision was not driven by ideology, it was driven by necessity. The mathematics of daily life no longer worked, savings were gone, credit was exhausted, the margin for endurance had disappeared. When workers approached management with requests for relief, they were not asking for structural change. They asked for rent reductions proportional to wage cuts. They asked for acknowledgement that the town and the factory were inseparable. The company refused. This refusal marked a turning point. It clarified what the system was and what it was not. It revealed that the town's stability depended entirely on conditions management could not guarantee, and that when those conditions failed, the burden would fall exclusively on residents. The decision to walk out did not come easily. It carried enormous risk. Employment opportunities elsewhere were limited. Leaving Pullman meant uprooting families and abandoning what little stability remained. Yet remaining meant accepting a future defined by shrinking wages, fixed expenses, and no voice. On May 11, 1894, nearly 4,000 workers stopped working. The factories fell silent. Production halted. Machinery stood idle. Pullman's response was immediate and uncompromising. He closed the works entirely. There would be no negotiation, no partial reopening, no acknowledgement of demands. From Pullman's perspective, the shutdown was a demonstration of authority. The company would not be coerced. From the workers' perspective, it confirmed their worst fears. The town's fate rested entirely on decisions made beyond their influence. The strike did not remain confined to Pullman. As Pullman's reputation spread, the town increasingly took on a symbolic role that extended far beyond its physical boundaries. It was discussed in newspapers, cited in speeches, and referenced in debates about the future of industrial society. For supporters, Pullman represented proof that private enterprise could solve problems traditionally left to governments. For critics, it hinted at something more troubling, though that criticism was often muted in the early years. What made Pullman persuasive as an idea was not merely its cleanliness or order, but the confidence with which it was presented. The town appeared finished, complete, and deliberate in a way that most American cities were not. There was no sense of improvisation. Everything seemed accounted for. In an era defined by uncertainty and rapid change, that sense of completion was deeply appealing. Yet this sense of completeness depended on exclusion. Decisions were made without input from those most affected by them. Authority flowed in one direction only. The absence of visible conflict was achieved not through agreement, but through design. Disagreement had no formal outlet. Political organization was discouraged. Social life unfolded within narrow boundaries that limited collective action. For many residents, this arrangement initially felt tolerable, even preferable. Compared to the instability of industrial neighborhoods elsewhere, Pullman offered predictability. Predictability created a sense of safety, and safety was not insignificant in a period marked by economic volatility. Over time, however, predictability hardened into confinement. The longer residents lived within the system, the more they became aware of what was missing. They noticed that rules were enforced without explanation, that rents were set without consultation, that improvements were made or delayed according to priorities they did not influence it. The town functioned efficiently but impersonally. Pullman's management viewed this impersonality as a virtue. Distance preserved authority. Authority preserved order. Order preserved productivity. This logic appeared internally consistent, but it relied on the assumption that workers would continue to accept their role indefinitely. That assumption was never tested under prosperity alone. It was tested under pressure. As economic conditions worsened, the town's lack of flexibility became increasingly apparent. Residents had no way to adapt collectively. They could not negotiate rents. They could not vote out administrators. They could not redirect resources. Every response required approval from the same authority responsible for the conditions they faced. This circular dependence created frustration rather than loyalty. The more residents understood how the system worked, the less they believed in its fairness. The town had been presented as a shared enterprise, but it functioned as a one-sided arrangement. Benefits flowed downward conditionally. Obligations flowed upward unconditionally. This imbalance was not immediately explosive, it was corrosive. Trust eroded slowly, often invisibly. By the time open resistance emerged, it was the product of years of quiet reassessment rather than sudden outrage. Pullman's design had removed chaos, but it had also removed legitimacy. When legitimacy disappears, authority must rely on enforcement alone. That shift marks the beginning of decline for any system, no matter how carefully constructed. As the town's reputation grew, Pullman increasingly became a reference point in discussions about the future of American industry. It was cited as evidence that the problems of industrial cities were not inevitable, but the result of poor management and insufficient oversight. Supporters argued that if more employers adopted similar models, labor unrest would diminish and productivity would rise. This argument rested on a particular understanding of human behavior. It assumed that workers responded primarily to environment rather than power, that if streets were clean, homes well built, and temptations removed, people would naturally align themselves with the goals of management. Conflict in this view was not political or economic, but behavioral. Pullman embraced this understanding fully. He believed that the disorder visible in other cities was not the product of inequality or exclusion, but of moral failure. Saloons, gambling, and unregulated social spaces were seen as sources of instability. By eliminating these influences, Pullman believed he was not restricting freedom, but protecting it. This framing mattered. It allowed the town to be presented as benevolent rather than coercive. Control was described as guidance, surveillance as care, regulation as improvement. Many observers accepted this interpretation because they encountered Pullman only briefly. They walked through its streets, admired its symmetry, and compared it favorably to the overcrowded districts of Chicago. They did not attend tenant meetings because there were none. They did not observe wage negotiations because they did not exist. They saw the surface, not the structure beneath it. The town's ability to sustain this perception depended on continued economic stability. As long as wages remained sufficient, the limits placed on autonomy felt tolerable. Comfort softened constraint. Order substituted for participation. But economic stability was never guaranteed. When the national economy began to falter, the assumptions underlying Pullman's design were tested for the first time. The system had been built to function under predictable conditions. It had not been built to absorb shock. As wages declined, residents found themselves confronting a contradiction that had always been present, but rarely examined. They lived in a city that claimed to protect them, yet offered no protection from hardship. The same authority that enforced cleanliness and order declined to acknowledge economic strain. Requests for adjustment were handled impersonally. Notices were issued, policies were cited, exceptions were avoided. The system behaved exactly as it had been designed to behave. For management, this consistency was proof of integrity. For residents, it was proof of indifference. The gap between these interpretations widened steadily. Management continued to view the town as a rational mechanism. Residents increasingly experienced it as an inflexible structure that demanded obedience without reciprocity. This shift did not produce immediate confrontation. It produced withdrawal. People spoke less openly. They avoided attracting attention. They focused on endurance rather than improvement. The town grew quieter, not more harmonious. Silence in this context was not peace, it was compression. Without forums for discussion or negotiation, dissatisfaction accumulated without release. Each denied request reinforced the same lesson. The system was not designed to listen, it was designed to operate. As this realization spread, the town's symbolic meaning changed for those who lived there. What had once been framed as a model of progress began to feel like an experiment conducted without consent. The cleanliness and order that visitors admired now served as reminders of how little control residents possessed over their own lives. This internal shift went largely unnoticed by outsiders. Newspapers continued to reference Pullman positively. Reformers cited it as an alternative to chaotic urban growth. The image persisted even as belief eroded from within. Pullman himself remained confident. He believed that pressure would reveal discipline, that hardship would reinforce order rather than undermine it. His refusal to engage directly with residents was not an oversight. It was a deliberate choice rooted in his understanding of authority. From his perspective, the town's structure was sound. Any unrest, therefore, must originate outside it. This conviction would shape every decision that followed. By the time resistance became visible, the system had already failed in a more fundamental way. It had lost the trust of those it depended on. Once that trust disappeared, order could be maintained only through force or withdrawal. The town had been built to eliminate conflict. Instead, it had postponed it. As economic pressure intensified, the gap between how Pullman was understood by those who governed it and those who lived within it continued to widen. Management viewed the town as a closed system whose rules were clear and whose outcomes were predictable. Residents increasingly experienced it as an arrangement that demanded sacrifice without offering security. This divergence mattered because Pullman's authority depended not only on control, but on belief. As long as residents believed the system was ultimately fair, its restrictions felt temporary and justified. Once that belief eroded, the same restrictions began to feel punitive. The design of the town amplified this shift. Because nearly every aspect of daily life passed through the company, there were few neutral spaces where frustration could be expressed without consequence. Complaints about housing, utilities, or inspections were routed back to the same authority responsible for enforcing them. There was no separation between regulator and provider. This structure discouraged open confrontation, but it also prevented resolution. In other cities, hardship often produced informal adaptations. Families took in lodgers, neighborhoods developed small economies that operated outside formal oversight. Community organizations emerged to provide assistance or advocate for change. Pullman's design left little room for these responses. Its efficiency depended on uniformity, and uniformity resisted improvisation. As a result, residents were forced to endure rather than adapt. The psychological toll of this endurance accumulated slowly. Anxiety replaced optimism. Caution replaced engagement. People learned to minimize attention, to avoid drawing notice, and to accept conditions they could not influence. The town remained orderly, but its social life grew increasingly constrained. This constraint was often mistaken for discipline. From the perspective of management, the absence of visible unrest confirmed that the system was functioning, rules were being followed, production continued, the town appeared stable. Yet this stability was increasingly superficial. Beneath it lay a growing sense of powerlessness. Workers understood that their livelihoods depended on decisions made far beyond their reach. They recognized that loyalty was expected but not reciprocated. The town's structure communicated clearly that residents were not partners in a shared project, but participants in a system that prioritized continuity over consent. This realization did not produce immediate rebellion, it produced calculation. People weighed the risks of speaking out against the certainty of consequence. They measured endurance against displacement. They considered alternatives that were increasingly scarce in a depressed economy. Many concluded that silence, however unsatisfying, was safer than confrontation. This collective restraint delayed conflict, but it also intensified it. By compressing dissatisfaction rather than addressing it, the system ensured that when resistance did emerge, it would arrive as a rupture rather than a negotiation. The absence of incremental adjustment left no middle ground. When workers finally organized formally, their demands reflected this accumulated frustration. They did not ask for sweeping reforms or political recognition. They asked for acknowledgement, for relief that reflected economic reality, for evidence that the town's design could accommodate hardship. The response they received confirmed what many had already suspected. Management refused to alter rents. It refused to recognize the link between wages and housing. It refused to engage directly with representatives. The system remained rigid, consistent, and unyielding. This consistency was interpreted differently on each side. To Pullman, it demonstrated resolve. To residents, it demonstrated disregard. The moment clarified the nature of the relationship. It revealed that the town's benefits were conditional, but its obligations were not. Residents were expected to absorb risk without influence, to endure without participation. Once this became clear, the logic of compliance collapsed. The decision to stop working was not impulsive. It was the result of a long process of elimination. Other options had been considered and found wanting. Appeals had been ignored. Adjustments had been denied. Endurance had reached its limit. When the factories fell silent, the town's design was tested in a way it had never been before. The same structure that had suppressed dissent now concentrated it. Workers who lived, worked, and socialized within the same controlled environment moved collectively, not because they had been encouraged to do so, but because no other response remained. The strike revealed what Pullman's design had concealed. The town was orderly but brittle, and once pressure exceeded determined limits, it could not adapt without breaking. As Pullman's reputation expanded, the town began to occupy a place in the national consciousness that was disproportionate to its size. It became a symbol, a microcosm of an industrial future that could be, and for many should be, the model for other cities across America. Its cleanliness, its order, its precision, all of these qualities were heralded as triumphs of private industry over the chaos of urban disorder. To those who viewed Pullman with admiration, it stood as living proof that the problems associated with industrialization, the squalor, the crime, the disarray, were not inevitable, but rather the result of poor management and insufficient foresight. They saw the town as an answer to the dilemmas faced by the sprawling cities of the time. In Pullman, management had provided not only housing, but a life shaped and curated to maintain order and stability. But as with any idea presented too perfectly, there were cracks beneath the surface, for as much as Pullman was praised for its apparent stability, its model was inherently limited by its rigidity. The very design that gave it its outward appearance of control, of a carefully constructed world, began to reveal its fatal flaw. It was not built for flexibility. It was a system that by design could not adapt to the pressures of change. And when the inevitable pressure came, as it always does, in an economy as volatile as the one Pullman was operating in, the town's facade of perfection would begin to crumble. In the early days, it was easy to ignore the subtle frustrations simmering beneath the surface. For many residents, the benefits of living in Pullman outweighed the minor irritations of an overly controlled environment. The streets were clean, the air fresh, the houses well maintained. There was a sense of security that came with this stability, an assurance that everything was in its place, that there was little chance of chaos disrupting the day-to-day. And in a country gripped by economic volatility, that predictability felt like a gift. But that same security, once a source of comfort, began to feel like a cage. As the years wore on, residents began to notice the tight grip the company had on their lives. They were told what to do, when to do it, and how to live. And while they had been promised a life free of the strife and uncertainty that characterized so many industrial cities, they were now confronted with the realization that their lives, their work, and their very existence were controlled by the same forces that controlled the town's appearance. The frustration that had been brewing beneath the surface for so long finally began to make itself known. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but rather a slow, steady awareness that began to spread among the residents. People started to talk. They shared their concerns in hushed voices, in the privacy of their homes or in small, informal gatherings. The sense of confinement, the feeling of being watched, of never being able to escape the gaze of the company, grew more pronounced. And as their wages stagnated and their rent remained high, the cracks in Pullman's perfect system began to show. The town, once hailed as a utopia, now felt more like a carefully constructed prison, and the more the residents came to understand this, the more they realized that their lives were not theirs to control. They were at the mercy of a system that had no place for negotiation, no place for dissent. And as the economy soured, the pressure built until it could no longer be ignored. Requests for adjustments were met with indifference. The company's response was always the same, polite but firm. The system works as it is. The words echoed in the minds of the residents as they watched their wages dwindle while the cost of living remained high. They saw the benefits of the system, but they also saw its limits that were no longer tolerable in a time of economic hardship. And then the unthinkable happened. The workers stopped. They refused to continue working. It wasn't a rash decision. It wasn't an emotional outburst. It was the result of years of quiet dissatisfaction, of waiting and hoping for something to change, for someone to listen, but no one did. And so when the workers finally took action, it was not out of anger, but out of necessity. They had been pushed to the brink, and now they had no other option. The strike that followed was not merely a work stoppage, it was a declaration. A declaration that the town's residents were no longer willing to live under the terms set by Pullman. It was a collective recognition that the system, as it had been constructed, was unsustainable. The workers, who had been the backbone of the town, now found themselves at odds with the very structure that had once promised them stability. But the strike was not just about wages or rent. It was about the larger issue of power, who held it and who had been denied it. The strike was a rejection of a system that had promised to care for its workers, but had instead treated them as tools to maintain a perfect facade. It was about the realization that the stability the company had promised was an illusion. That illusion was now shattered. As the reputation of Pullman grew across the country, it was hailed as a triumph of private enterprise. It was used as evidence in speeches, discussed in newspapers, and often cited in debates about the future of industrial society. To its supporters, Pullman was a beacon, a proof that private industry could provide the structure and stability that traditional government-run systems could not. But for all its apparent success, there were cracks beneath the surface. Critics, though muted at first, began to whisper about what they saw as a troubling reality. Pullman's town, gleaming with order and efficiency, was built on a foundation of exclusion. Its residents were not participants in a shared democratic process. They were subjects of a well-controlled system. The rules that governed their lives were enforced without explanation or consultation. Discontent was not tolerated. There were no forums for debate, no avenues for collective action. At first, this lack of participation seemed tolerable to many residents. Compared to the instability of other industrial neighborhoods, life in Pullman felt calm, predictable, and secure. There was safety in the structure of the town, a reassurance that came with the orderly streets, well-maintained homes, and the promise of security against the economic volatility that affected other cities. But over time, predictability began to harden into confinement. The illusion of safety gave way to a deeper awareness of the system's constraints. The residents began to notice that decisions about their lives were made without their input. Rent increases were imposed without consultation, and improvements or delays in the town were determined by priorities that had nothing to do with their needs. The efficiency of the system, once a source of pride, began to feel impersonal. There were no personal connections between the residents and the authorities. The company viewed this impersonality as a virtue. Distance preserved authority, and authority maintained order. But what was hidden beneath this facade was a growing sense of frustration and powerlessness among the people who lived there. As economic hardship struck, the rigid system that had once promised stability now became a source of deep frustration. The residents found themselves confronted with a cruel paradox. They were living in a town designed to protect them, yet they found that this protection was not extended in times of economic crisis. Requests for adjustments were met with impersonal notices and dismissive policies. The very system that promised to provide for them now stood firm in its refusal to adapt changing conditions. The workers, who had once been part of a smoothly operating machine, now found themselves helpless in the face of hardship. The company's unyielding stance sent a clear message. The town's design was not built to accommodate the changing realities of its residents. It had been created to operate under stable conditions, not to bend or break in times of stress. When the economic downturn came, the workers were left with no recourse, no means of negotiating their survival. They were at the mercy of the very system that had promised them security. This growing frustration did not manifest immediately in acts of defiance. Instead, it took the form of quiet withdrawal. Conversations about the town's failings took place in hushed tones. Residents, increasingly aware of their lack of power, began to focus on survival rather than improvement. They avoided making waves, minimized attention, and learned to endure rather than resist. But silence, as it often does, bred discontent. What was once tolerable became suffocating. The residents began to realize that the town, for all its promises, was not a shared project. It was a machine that operated without concern for the people who fueled it. Then came the strike. It was not sudden, nor was it born out of a single event. It was the result of years of accumulated frustration, of people who had come to understand that their lives, their work, and their future were controlled by a system that valued order above all else. The workers, who had once accepted the rules of the town with quiet resignation, now saw no other option but to act. The strike was not merely a demand for better wages or more affordable housing. It was a demand for recognition, for acknowledgement that the system could no longer operate as it had. It was a rejection of a system that promised security but delivered nothing but control. The workers were no longer willing to live under conditions that stripped them of their agency. The strike revealed the brittleness of Pullman's design. The town had been built to withstand hardship, but only when that hardship was predictable. When the unexpected came, the structure faltered. The workers, living in a town that was meant to protect them, had nowhere to turn but to each other. Their collective action was a direct challenge to the very system that had once promised them a harmonious life. And in the end, that system could not absorb the shock of resistance. The town of Pullman, which had once seemed like the epitome of industrial success, was now a symbol of a deeper, more troubling truth. No system, no matter how well designed, can last without the trust of those who live within it. The workers had come to understand that their participation in the system was not voluntary. it was compulsory. They had no say in how their lives were managed, and when hardship came, they were left to face it alone. The strike that followed marked the beginning of the end of Pullman's carefully constructed world. The facade of harmony that had once been so convincing now cracked under the pressure of discontent. The town, once seen as a model for others, was now a cautionary tale about the limits of control and the fragility of trust. As the days passed and the strike continued, the true nature of Pullman's design became clear. It was not a community but a mechanism, and once that mechanism was disrupted, it could not be repaired without addressing the very flaws that had been hidden beneath its polished surface. The workers, once passive participants in a system that had promised them safety, had now become the agents of change. And in doing so, they revealed the truth about Pullman. It was not a utopia, but a carefully controlled experiment that had reached its breaking point. The tension that had built up over months, even years, was now openly visible. What had been a quiet undercurrent of dissatisfaction within Pullman was now a loud, undeniable force. The strike was no longer just a work stoppage, it was a battle for the very soul of the town. The workers, who had once been part of a carefully orchestrated system, now stood at odds with the machinery that had controlled their lives for so long. Their demands were simple, yet profound: recognition, fairness, and a voice in the system that dictated their every move. For the company, the strike was a direct challenge to the authority that had been unquestioned for so long. Pullman had never anticipated that its carefully designed system, built on a foundation of control and predictability, would falter under pressure. It was a model that had worked until it didn't. Pullman's refusal to adapt, to bend even slightly to the changing realities of the workers, had led them to this point. The response from management was swift and uncompromising. Pullman had always prided itself on its ability to maintain order, and it would not allow this disturbance to tarnish its carefully crafted image. The company began to use its power to forcefully suppress the strike, calling in authorities to restore order. This only escalated the situation, pushing the workers into an even more entrenched position. What had started as a quiet protest had now become a full-fledged stand for justice. The workers, however, were no longer just reacting to the immediate pressures of their circumstances. The strike had taken on a larger meaning. It was no longer simply about wages, rents, or conditions. It was about dignity, respect, and the right to have a say in the way they lived their lives. For the first time, the workers saw themselves not as subordinates, but as equal partners in the town's future. But even as the strike gained momentum, the reality of the situation began to set in. The workers were up against a powerful system, one that was determined to maintain its control at any cost. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the strike became a symbol of resistance not just for Pullman, but for all the industrial towns that had been built on similar foundations of control and submission. The workers were not just fighting for their own futures, but for the dignity of workers everywhere. The response from Pullman's management only deepened the divide. The company, confident in its control, saw no reason to compromise. The longer the strike lasted, the more entrenched both sides became. It was no longer just a disagreement over terms. It was a battle over who held the power to define the future. And with each passing day, the cracks in Pullman's carefully constructed system became more apparent. The town that had once been a shining example of industrial success was now a symbol of failure, a reminder of the dangers of a system that places control above humanity. As the strike dragged on, the toll it took on both the workers and the company became undeniable. The residents of Pullman had once lived in a carefully crafted world, one that promised security, order, and predictability. But that world had proven to be a house of cards, fragile and easily toppled when faced with adversity. The workers, who had once accepted their roles without question, now stood united in their demand for change. But the deeper tragedy lay in the realization that Pullman's model had failed not because it lacked efficiency or order, but because it lacked humanity. The system had been built to function like a machine, with workers as mere cogs in the wheel. But when the workers began to assert their rights, when they demanded respect and recognition, the system could no longer adapt, it could no longer function as it had been designed. The strike, though long and painful, was a necessary rupture in the system. It was a moment of clarity, a realization that no system, no matter how well designed, could survive without the trust and cooperation of the people who lived within it. Pullman had been built on the assumption that the workers would always accept their position, that they would always play their part without question. But the workers had made it clear that they would no longer accept a life without agency, without a voice. The conflict that unfolded in Pullman would not be easily resolved. The strike may have ended, but the damage had been done. The town, once a shining example of industrial success, had revealed its fundamental flaw. It was not the system that had failed, it was the people who had been left out of the equation. In the end, Pullman's design had failed because it had been built on a foundation of control and exclusion rather than on partnership and respect. As the strike ended and the dust began to settle, the future of Pullman remained uncertain. The workers had achieved a victory of sorts, but the town that had been built in their image no longer existed. What remained was a symbol of the limits of control, the fragility of authority, and the power of collective action. The story of Pullman was far from over, but it had become clear that the town, once the epitome of industrial success, was now a cautionary tale of what happens when a system forgets its humanity. The aftermath of the strike left a lingering bitterness in Pullman, though the full impact of the workers' resistance would only become clear with time. The company's refusal to engage with the demands of its employees had created an irrevocable rupture in the relationship between management and labor. What had been an orderly, albeit controlled, community had now become a symbol of resistance, an emblem of what happens when workers, once passive and obedient, rise up and demand their rightful place within a system that had taken them for granted. Pullman, as a symbol, had been shattered, but the town itself endured, its streets still pristine, its homes well kept. Yet beneath this veneer of order, the underlying fractures were too deep to repair with simple efficiency or appeasement. The residents who had once accepted their place in the town now carried with them the knowledge that their lives were not merely a matter of work and obedience. They were people with desires, frustrations, and most importantly, a voice. The company, for its part, attempted to restore order by reinstating its previous policies, but the damage had been done. The town that had once been a model for others now appeared as a cautionary tale. Management had not learned the most important lesson of all. A system that provides for its people but denies them a voice will eventually face rebellion, not because of its flaws in design, but because of its refusal to acknowledge the humanity of those it governs. The residents of Pullman, in many ways, had been the unwitting subjects of a grand experiment. The initial promise of stability and order had enticed them, offering them something they had never had before, a life free of chaos and instability. But as the years wore on, the cost of this stability became clear. They had traded freedom for security, agency for control. They had been provided with everything but the one thing they truly needed: dignity. As Pullman's story continued to unfold, it became apparent that the town's future would be shaped not by the control of its authorities, but by the forces that had once been relegated to the margins, the workers. Their strike had been a testament to the strength that arises when people come together in solidarity, when they realize that their collective voice holds more power than any individual decree. In the years following the strike, the town of Pullman would be forever changed. Though the company would continue to operate and the streets would remain as immaculate as ever, the spirit of the town had shifted. The sense of community that had once been manufactured and controlled by management had been replaced with a new kind of unity, one forged in the fires of resistance and fueled by the knowledge that no matter how tightly a system is constructed, it can only endure as long as the people within it choose to believe in its fairness. And yet, as the years passed, the legacy of Pullman would remain a complex one. It would serve as a reminder of what can happen when a system of control becomes so rigid that it crushes the very spirit it was meant to protect. It would be remembered as a warning about the dangers of treating people as tools in a machine, as subjects in an experiment, rather than as partners in a shared vision. The story of Pullman at its heart is a story about human nature, the desire for autonomy, the need for respect, and the undeniable truth that no one can live in a system that is indifferent to their humanity for long, without eventually demanding change. The workers of Pullman had understood this in the most profound way, and they had paid a price for it. But in doing so, they had also forged a new path, one that would echo through the corridors of labor history for years to come. Pullman would never again be the idealized symbol it once was. The perfect town, the shining example of industrial success, had been revealed for what it was, a fragile illusion built on the premise that order could be achieved without participation. The truth of Pullman's story, however, was far more complex. It was a story of resilience, of the power of collective action, and of the eventual realization that the greatest strength a system can possess is not control, but the trust and cooperation of those who live within it. As time wore on, Pullman's legacy as a model town became more contested, its carefully constructed image cracked and uneven. Despite the company's attempt to restore its old structure, the atmosphere had irrevocably changed. The town remained, but the spirits of the workers were no longer subdued. The rupture caused by the strike, though outwardly mended in the immediate aftermath, had planted the seeds of a much larger transformation, one that could not be reversed by mere adjustments to rent or wages. The workers' realization of their collective power marked a pivotal moment in American industrial history. It was no longer just a struggle for better conditions or wages. It was a battle for dignity, for the right to shape one's own future. And while the strike had ended, its impact lingered in the air, its presence felt in the conversations of every worker who had participated and in those who had quietly observed the events unfold. Pullman, once seen as the epitome of industrial success, was now a living example of the dangers of a system that removed the voices of those who made it function. The workers, who had once felt that they were being provided for, now realized that they had been excluded from the very decisions that governed their lives. The company's inability to engage with its employees on an equal footing had led to a fracture that could never be fully healed. The company's leadership, too, faced a shifting reality. Pullman, the man, remained confident in his vision. He believed that the orderly, well-regulated structure of his town was the future of industrial society, and he saw the events of the strike as a temporary disturbance, a minor inconvenience in an otherwise flawless system. His refusal to acknowledge the workers' grievances as legitimate only deepened the divide between management and labor. The strike, in his view, had been a test of resolve, and his response had been one of unyielding authority. To him the system had held, but it was clear that his view of strength was different from the workers' experience of it. In the aftermath, the company continued to operate, but the public perception of Pullman had shifted. Outside of the town, the strike had drawn national attention. Editorials and articles across the country debated the merits and failures of the Pullman model. For some, it was an example of the potential of industrial paternalism, while for others, it was a cautionary tale about the perils of centralized control and the erasure of individual agency. The town, once hailed as the ideal, had become a symbol of a deeper truth. No system, no matter how well organized, could function without the active, willing participation of those it governed. But the workers, even as they returned to their lives in Pullman, were changed. They had tasted solidarity, the power that came from standing together in pursuit of a common cause. This experience would shape them in ways that management could not understand. The strike had sparked a new sense of identity among the workers, one that could no longer be easily ignored or repressed. No longer were they content to live in a system that dictated their every move. They had seen the possibility of a different kind of relationship with the forces that controlled their lives. They had seen the power that came from collective action, and they would not forget it. As Pullman continued to operate, the sense of complacency that had once defined the town was slowly replaced with a simmering undercurrent of change. The workers, though weary from the struggles they had endured, had gained something far more valuable than any material concession. They had gained agency. The trust that had been broken between the company and its residents could never be fully repaired, and though the company would continue to control the town's daily operations, the workers now understood the fragility of their submission. In the years that followed, Pullman would remain a place of quiet tension. The town was efficient, its streets clean and orderly, its homes well maintained, but there was a deep, unspoken knowledge among the workers that the system, for all its stability, had never been designed to meet their needs. They had come to understand that while the town's infrastructure was built on the principles of control and order, its true strength would always lie in the willingness of those who lived within it to accept that control. As the economy slowly recovered, Pullman attempted to regain its status as a shining example of industrial prosperity. New buildings were constructed, new systems of order were put in place, and the company resumed its efforts to create a sense of unity. But this time, the unity felt hollow. The workers, while not openly rebellious, were now more aware of the limitations of the system they lived within. They had learned a painful lesson. That control, no matter how efficient, was never enough to ensure the loyalty of those it governed. Pullman's story, once a symbol of industrial success, had become a story of warning about the dangers of unchecked power, the importance of participation, and the fundamental truth that no system can thrive without the trust of those it serves. As the years passed, the lessons of Pullman would be passed down, not just to future generations of workers, but to the leaders who would eventually take charge of the growing industrial landscape of America. In the end, the story of Pullman would not be remembered for its design or its efficiency. It would be remembered for its failure to recognize the humanity of those it sought to control. The workers who had fought for their rights had, in their resistance, reshaped the future of industrial society. And while Pullman, the company, would continue on, its legacy was forever marked by the strike that had revealed the true cost of control. Railroads across the country depended on Pullman cars for passenger service. When workers refused to handle those cars, the effects rippled outward. Trains were delayed, schedules unraveled, entire lines slowed or stopped. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, recognized the significance of the moment. Debs viewed the Pullman dispute not as an isolated conflict, but as a test of whether industrial labor could exert collective influence over national systems. The union escalated strategically. Workers were instructed to boycott Pullman cars. The resistance was initially quiet and procedural. Cars were uncoupled, orders were followed slowly, connections were missed. This restraint proved effective. Railroad executives pressured the federal government to intervene. They framed the strike as a threat to interstate commerce and public order. Mail delivery was disrupted. Freight shipments stalled. The nation's transportation network, still heavily dependent on railroads, began to seize. In Washington, the dispute was no longer discussed as a labor issue. It was framed as a challenge to authority. The federal government intervened decisively. Troops were dispatched to Chicago under the justification of protecting interstate commerce and ensuring the delivery of mail. Their arrival transformed the strike immediately. What had been an economic conflict became a confrontation between citizens and the state. Violence followed. Rail yards were burned. Crowds clashed with soldiers. Dozens were killed. Many more were injured. Debs was arrested. Without centralized leadership, the strike collapsed. Trains resumed running. The immediate crisis ended. But the Pullman experiment had been irreversibly altered. When the strike collapsed, order returned to the railroads more quickly than it returned to the town of Pullman. Trains began to move again. Passenger schedules stabilized. Freight shipments resumed. From the perspective of the federal government and railroad executives, the crisis had been resolved. Authority had been reasserted. Commerce continued. Inside Pullman, the aftermath unfolded more slowly. Workers returned to their jobs, but the meaning of the town had changed permanently. The sense that Pullman represented a shared experiment in progress had vanished. What remained was a system exposed by stress, one whose logic no longer inspired confidence. The physical environment had not changed. Streets were still maintained. Buildings remained intact. Public spaces looked as they always had. Yet the psychological atmosphere was unmistakably different. Every feature of the town that once symbolized order now reminded residents of how little control they possessed. The company's authority, though intact, no longer carried legitimacy. Public reaction to the strike reflected this shift. Newspapers that had once praised Pullman's town as a model of industrial harmony began to reassess it. Editorials described the arrangement as feudal, an anachronism hidden behind modern architecture. Reformers who had previously admired the town's cleanliness now questioned the absence of self-governance. The federal government launched an investigation into the Pullman Company's practices. The inquiry examined not only the events of the strike, but the structure of the town itself. Investigators focused on the combination of roles held by the company: employer, landlord, civic authority. Their conclusions were critical. They acknowledged that the town was well designed and well maintained. They noted its sanitary conditions and orderly layout, but they also emphasized that workers lived under constant oversight without meaningful representation or recourse. The arrangement placed residents in a position of complete dependency. The town, they concluded, was fundamentally incompatible with American civic principles. This judgment did not immediately dismantle Pullman's authority. The company continued to operate, workers continued to live in company housing, but the experiment's intellectual foundation had been undermined. Pullman was no longer cited as a model to be emulated. It became an example to be questioned. George Pullman himself remained largely unmoved by this shift in opinion. He did not publicly acknowledge fault. He continued to defend the town as a rational system unfairly judged by emotional reaction. From his perspective, the strike had proven the dangers of labor organization rather than the flaws of his design. He did not live long enough to see the final outcome. In 1897, George Pullman died quietly. His death was marked not by public tribute, but by tension. His family feared that anger over the strike had not dissipated. They worried that his grave might become a target for resentment. The precautions taken during his burial were extraordinary. His body was encased in concrete and steel, sealed beneath layers designed to prevent disturbance. Even in death, Pullman's authority carried consequences. Shortly afterward, the legal fate of the town was decided. In 1898, the Illinois Supreme Court ruled that the Pullman Company could no longer own and operate the residential portion of the town. The court determined that the arrangement exceeded the proper scope of corporate authority. The company was ordered to divest its residential properties and dismantle the structure that governed daily life in Pullman. The ruling ended the experiment definitively. The transition was not dramatic. There were no ceremonies marking the moment, no speeches announcing the end of an era. Instead, the system unraveled gradually. Homes were sold to private owners, municipal authority shifted. The town was absorbed into the expanding city of Chicago. What had once been a controlled environment became an ordinary neighborhood. The disappearance of Pullman as a company town did not erase its influence. The Pullman Strike became a reference point in debates over labor rights, corporate power, and government intervention. It demonstrated how quickly industrial disputes could escalate when no mechanisms for negotiation existed. It also reshaped public perception of company towns. Before Pullman, corporate paternalism was often viewed as enlightened. After Pullman, it appeared dangerous. The idea that employers should control not only labor, but housing, commerce, and social life lost legitimacy. Public opinion shifted toward the belief that such concentration of power was incompatible with democratic norms. This shift did not occur through a single law or reform. It emerged gradually, shaped by memory and precedent. Pullman became part of the national consciousness not as a success, but as a warning. In the years that followed, similar projects were proposed with greater caution. Planners emphasized municipal governance. Corporations distanced themselves from direct control over residential life. The language of reform replaced the language of discipline. Yet the impulse that created Pullman did not disappear entirely. The belief that social problems could be solved through design and authority continued to surface in different forms. Planned communities, industrial zones, housing projects, each reflected a desire to impose order on complexity. Pullman remained the clearest early example of where that impulse could lead. In the decades that followed the dissolution of Pullman as a company town, the physical remnants of the experiment remained largely intact, even as its governing philosophy faded from view. Brick homes continued to line the streets. Public buildings stood in quiet symmetry. The town's design, once intended to enforce order, became an object of historical curiosity rather than authority. Yet the meaning of Pullman did not disappear with its legal end. It lingered as a case study in the limits of centralized control. The Gilded Age produced extraordinary confidence in systems. Industrial leaders believed that scale itself was a solution, that problems of labor, morality, and efficiency could be addressed through planning rather than participation. In this worldview, complexity was something to be eliminated, not accommodated. Pullman embodied this belief more completely than most. It was not simply a factory or a housing project. It was an entire civic structure designed to operate without negotiation. The town assumed that people would accept restriction in exchange for comfort, and that stability would follow naturally from control. For a time, this assumption appeared justified. Under favorable economic conditions, the system functioned. Workers were employed, homes were maintained. The absence of visible disorder reinforced the belief that the design was sound. But the experiment was never tested under ideal conditions alone. When pressure arrived, the system revealed its core weakness. It could not adapt. It offered no mechanism for shared decision-making, no outlet for grievance, no way to adjust without undermining its own authority. In this sense, Pullman did not fail because it was poorly executed. It failed because it was too rigid. The same features that made the town efficient also made it fragile. This realization would echo through later debates about urban planning, corporate responsibility, and labor relations. Pullman demonstrated that order imposed from above could produce compliance, but not resilience. Resilience required participation. George Pullman believed deeply in progress. He believed that human behavior could be shaped through environment, that moral outcomes could be engineered through structure. His intentions were not rooted in cruelty, but in certainty. He was convinced that he understood the problem well enough to solve it alone. This conviction was shared by many of his contemporaries. The Gilded Age rewarded confidence. It elevated men who acted decisively and dismissed hesitation as weakness. Within that culture, Pullman's vision did not appear extreme. It appeared logical. Only later did its implications become clear. The town's quiet end is what makes its story unsettling. There was no dramatic reckoning, no public confession of error. The experiment simply became indefensible, and so it was dismantled. Today, Pullman exists as a historic district, preserved and studied. Visitors walk its streets and admire its architecture. They see evidence of ambition, coherence, and care. What is less visible is the tension that once defined daily life there. The knowledge that every aspect of existence depended on continued obedience, the awareness that stability was conditional, the understanding that dissent had no place within the system. Pullman serves as a reminder that progress is not only a matter of efficiency or design, it is a matter of balance. Power without accountability can create order, but it cannot create trust, and trust, once lost, cannot be restored through structure alone. The story of Pullman endures because it reflects a recurring temptation, the belief that complex human systems can be perfected through control, that uncertainty can be eliminated, that participation is optional. History suggests otherwise. Pullman's town was built to eliminate conflict. Instead, it revealed its source. In that failure, it left behind something more enduring than success. A lesson written not in legislation or proclamation, but in the slow disappearance of a city that once believed it had solved the problem of human nature.